I had been working on deep-sea research vessels for almost 9 years before the expedition that changed the way I think about the ocean. Most of that time was pretty ordinary. I spent more time checking equipment, filling out reports, fixing small problems, and waiting for other people to finish their work than I did actually seeing anything interesting. I liked it that way. The ocean was interesting enough without needing anything strange to happen. The expedition started because of several cracks that had been found near the deepest known part of the Mariana Trench. The first signs had been picked up by a Marine Corps underwater survey team that was testing some equipment in the area. They noticed long breaks in the seafloor during a routine scan. At first, nobody thought much of it because the ocean floor moves all the time. There are earthquakes, landslides, and pressure changes down there. What made these cracks unusual was that some of them seemed to have appeared between two separate scans taken only a few months apart. They were also deeper than the team had expected to find anything worth investigating. A few unmanned vehicles were sent down to get better images. 2 stopped working before reaching the area. The third made it there and sent back several hours of footage before something happened to it. The official explanation was equipment failure, but I remember seeing the recovered housing when it was brought back to the ship. Part of the outer casing had been scraped badly. There were several long marks across the metal, and nobody could agree on what had made them. I was not part of that first team, so I only heard about it afterward. Our submarine was brought in because the next stage required people to go down there. It was a small research submarine with enough room for 6 people, although only 5 of us were inside during the descent. I was responsible for monitoring some of the internal systems and helping with the cameras. I was not the commander, and I was not some fearless deep-sea explorer either. I had been down several times before, but I had never gone anywhere close to this depth. Before the expedition, I spent nearly 3 weeks helping prepare the submarine. We checked the seals, batteries, lights, cameras, emergency tanks, and everything else that could possibly fail. The people in charge were especially careful because the pressure at those depths left very little room for mistakes. I remember joking to myself that we had probably spent more time checking the submarine than we would actually spend looking at the cracks. The descent took hours. For most of it, there was nothing unusual to see. The water outside gradually changed from blue to dark gray, and then to black. Eventually, the only thing visible through the windows was whatever our lights happened to catch. Fish became less common until we stopped seeing them altogether. Every now and then, something small would pass through the beam, but most of the time I was staring at darkness and instrument readings. The deeper we went, the more I started noticing how much I was relying on the numbers instead of what I could see. Depth, pressure, temperature, battery power, oxygen. Those numbers gave me something normal to focus on. They made the whole thing feel like a machine doing a job rather than 5 people sitting inside a metal container several miles beneath the surface. When we finally reached the area where the cracks had been detected, we spent a long time looking for them. The first scan showed what looked like a normal section of seabed. There were ridges and loose material scattered across the bottom, and the visibility was poor because our lights could only reach so far. Then the camera picked up the first crack. It was much wider than I expected. From our position, it looked like a dark line running across the floor and disappearing into the distance. We moved closer and followed it for several minutes. It seemed to continue far beyond what our lights could show us. The strange part was that the crack did not look fresh. There was no obvious loose rock falling into it, and the edges were strangely smooth in some places. I remember thinking that it looked more like something had pushed the ground apart than something had broken through it. We moved over the crack and lowered a small camera into it. That was when we noticed something that did not make sense. The camera kept ascending. We expected it to reach the bottom after a few hundred feet, but the cable continued feeding out. The readings showed empty space underneath us. There was no solid floor immediately below the crack. At first, I thought the equipment was giving us bad information. Then the camera operator adjusted the angle, and we saw what appeared to be another layer of rock beneath the first one. There was a large gap between them. Nobody had expected that. We moved the submarine closer to get a better look. The gap appeared to continue for a long distance, and there were strange shapes along the walls. They looked like thin pieces of rock hanging down, although some of them seemed to move slightly in the water. I remember staring at one of them for a while because I could not tell whether it was attached to the wall or floating. Then it moved toward the camera. I assumed it was a piece of debris being carried by the current. It came closer until it was directly in front of the lens. That was the first time I saw one of them. It looked almost invisible. I could only see it because the camera light caught the edges of its body. There was something there, but it was transparent enough that I could see the rock behind it. It had a long body, several thin extensions, and something that looked like a head, although I could not make out any eyes. It stayed in front of the camera for several seconds. Then it moved away. We watched it disappear into the darkness below us. I remember feeling relieved when it was gone because I thought we had simply found some strange deep-sea animal. A few minutes later, we saw another one. Then another. They were coming from the gap beneath the seafloor. We had no idea how many there were because the camera could only see a small area, but I remember looking at the darkness beyond the light and wondering how far that space actually went. We continued scanning the crack for another hour. Nothing else happened until something appeared on the submarine's external camera. It was much closer this time. It was moving alongside the hull. I watched it drift through the light, and for a moment, I could see the entire shape of its body. It was larger than the first one, maybe the size of a person, although it was difficult to judge because there was nothing nearby for comparison. It moved toward the submarine. I remember leaning closer to the screen because I wanted to see whether it would touch the hull. It did. And then I watched part of its body disappear through the metal. I remember freezing when I saw the creature go through the hull because my first thought was that I had misunderstood what I was seeing. The camera angle was not great, and there were small particles floating in the water, so I kept looking at the monitor expecting the shape to move away from the submarine. Instead, part of its body seemed to disappear into the metal. I checked the other camera because I thought there might have been a reflection, or some kind of problem with the image, but the second camera showed the same thing from a different angle. The creature was still there, pressed against the side of the submarine, and the part touching the hull was no longer visible. I did not immediately think it had gone through the metal. I spent a few seconds trying to find another explanation because that was easier to accept. The submarine had several layers of metal around the pressure chamber, and there was no way an animal should have been able to get through them. I remember checking the hull pressure reading because that was the first thing that came to mind. If there was a hole, even a small one, the pressure sensors should have shown something. They did not. Everything inside the submarine was normal. The creature eventually pulled away from the hull, and when it did, I could see its entire body again. There was no damage where it had touched us. I checked the external camera as closely as I could and could not find a scratch. One of the other crew members began checking the hull sensors manually, while the rest of us kept watching the creature. It moved slowly away from the submarine and disappeared into the darkness near the crack. We probably should have left at that point. Looking back, I think all of us knew that. The problem was that nobody wanted to be the person who ended the expedition after we had finally found something that could explain what had been happening down there. We had spent months preparing for this trip, and the people above us had spent a lot of money getting us there. There was also the fact that none of us understood what we had seen. We needed more information before we could even write a useful report. We brought the camera back toward the crack and started scanning the area again. The strange thing was that the creatures did not seem interested in the submarine after the first one moved away. They stayed close to the lower part of the crack, and whenever our lights moved toward them, they usually moved in the opposite direction. I started wondering if they were afraid of the light. That seemed reasonable because most deep-sea animals avoid bright lights, although I had never seen anything behave quite like these things. The camera picked up several more of them over the next 20 minutes. Some were small enough to fit inside the palm of a hand. Others were probably 2 or 3 feet long. They were all transparent, although their shapes were different. Some had long bodies, while others were wider and had several thin parts extending from them. Because their bodies were almost clear, it was difficult to tell where one ended and another began when they were close together. Then the camera stopped working. The screen went black for a few seconds and came back with a distorted image. We assumed the cable had been damaged, so we started bringing it back up. About halfway through the recovery, the camera returned to normal. I remember looking at the feed and seeing the crack from a different angle. That was when I noticed something behind it. There was a large opening underneath the seabed. At first, I thought it was another crack, but when we moved the camera closer, we could see that it was much larger than the first one. The rock layer above it was almost like a ceiling. Below that ceiling was a huge open space filled with water. I checked the depth reading twice, because I thought I had read it wrong. The camera was still below us, but the sonar was showing another large space underneath the seafloor. It was difficult to understand because we were already at a depth where the ocean floor should have been resting on solid rock. There should not have been an open body of water underneath it. We moved the submarine over the opening and lowered the camera again. This time, instead of sending it straight down, we moved it through the crack itself. The camera passed between two pieces of rock and entered the space underneath. The first thing I noticed was that the water looked different. I cannot explain exactly how, but the camera image became clearer after we went through. There was less loose material floating around, and the light seemed to travel farther. We could see a wall on one side of the opening, but the other side was too far away for the camera to reach. Then the sonar started giving us readings that none of us expected. There was water extending below the seafloor for a huge distance. The machine could not find a bottom. We tried different settings because we thought the sonar was picking up the walls of the cavern and confusing the depth. We ran the scan again, and the result was almost the same. There was a large space beneath us. The problem was that the space did not look like a normal cave. The walls were too far apart, and the water inside was moving slowly in a way that suggested there was some kind of current. We could also see shapes in the distance. At first I assumed they were rocks, but then one of them moved. The camera operator turned toward it. A transparent shape passed through the light and disappeared behind a rock formation. We watched the area for several minutes, hoping it would appear again. It did, but this time there were two of them. Then 3. I remember feeling uncomfortable because the number of them seemed to be increasing whenever we looked farther into the opening. I could not tell if more creatures were coming toward us, or if we were simply seeing ones that had been hidden before. We decided to bring the camera back. As it started moving upward, something hit it. The image shook hard enough that I nearly lost my balance. The camera feed became blurry, then cleared again. We could see the cable moving through the water. Then the camera turned. One of the transparent creatures was attached to it. It was wrapped around the camera housing, and I could see the metal frame through its body. It did not appear to have a mouth or anything that looked like teeth. It was simply holding onto the camera with several thin parts of its body. The operator tried moving the camera faster. The creature stayed attached. Then something happened that made everyone stop what they were doing. The creature began moving through the camera housing. It did not break the metal. It did not damage the camera. Its body simply passed through it. The camera image suddenly showed the inside of its body before the creature disappeared completely. A few seconds later, the camera started rising again. When we brought it back inside, the housing was still intact. There was no damage anywhere on the metal. I remember touching the camera because I wanted to convince myself that what I had just watched could not have happened. The metal was cold from the water, and there were small drops running down the side. Everything looked normal. We had no explanation for it. The mission commander decided that we should continue the survey but stay above the lower opening. That decision made sense at the time. We still had to collect enough information to report what we had found, and nobody wanted to send the submarine into an unknown space without knowing what was inside. We spent another hour scanning the area. That was when the sonar picked up something much larger. The reading appeared beneath the crack and moved slowly across the screen. At first, I thought it was a large section of rock shifting, but the movement was too smooth. It traveled from one side of the scan to the other without changing speed. We watched it for several minutes. It was moving toward us. I remember checking the depth because I wanted to know how far below us it was. The reading showed that whatever we were looking at was several hundred feet beneath the seafloor. Then the sonar showed another object, and another. The lower space was not empty. There was something living down there, and we had only seen the ones that had come close enough to our camera. We were preparing to leave when the submarine's lights flickered. It lasted less than a second. Then they came back. I checked the power readings and saw that everything was still normal, but one of the external cameras had stopped working. Before we could figure out why, the sonar picked up movement directly beneath the submarine. Something had come up through the crack. It was close enough that the sonar image filled most of the screen. I looked toward the observation window without thinking, even though I knew the outside would be almost completely dark. Then our forward light caught something moving beneath us. It was much larger than the creatures we had seen before, and it was coming up. I could not tell how large the thing was because the water around it was so dark, but the part caught by our lights looked much bigger than the creatures we had seen earlier. It moved slowly at first, and I remember watching its shape pass through the beam while trying to find something on the seafloor that I could use for comparison. There was nothing close enough. The only thing I could make out was a pale outline and several long parts extending from its body. The outline changed whenever it moved, which made it difficult to tell where its body ended. I kept thinking it was going to turn away from us, but instead it continued coming upward. The submarine was still above the crack, so we started moving away from it. We did not make any sudden movements because there was no reason to know how the creature would react. The pilot increased our distance slowly while the rest of us watched the sonar. The large shape stopped following us after a short distance. It remained below the opening, and for a few minutes there was nothing else on the screen except the smaller creatures moving around it. Then several of the smaller ones began moving upward. At first there were only a few. They came through the crack and spread out around the submarine. Some moved past the windows, and because they were transparent, I could see the darkness through their bodies. One passed directly in front of me, and for a second I could see what looked like a faint network running through it. I could not tell whether those were organs, veins, or something else. I only remember thinking that it looked more like a living thing than I had expected. More of them started coming through. We counted at least 20 within a few minutes, but I stopped counting because they were moving in and out of the lights, and I kept losing track. They were not attacking us. Most of them seemed to be moving upward and away from the submarine. A few came close to the hull, but none touched it. That actually made things harder for me to understand. If they were dangerous, I could at least have made sense of what we were seeing. Instead, they behaved like animals trying to get somewhere. We began preparing to leave the area. The plan was simple. We would move back along the route we had used to get there, record everything we had collected, and let the people on the surface decide what to do next. I remember feeling relieved when we started moving, because I had been uncomfortable for some time, but I also felt embarrassed by how relieved I was. Part of me still thought we had probably found some unusual animal, and that everything would make sense once we had better samples and more information. We had not gone very far when one of the external cameras showed something strange. A transparent creature was moving alongside us. It stayed almost perfectly level with the submarine, matching our speed. I watched it for several minutes and started wondering if it was following us. Then another appeared on the other side. I checked the sonar and found several more behind us. There were more than I had realized. The pilot slowed down, and the creatures slowed down with us. We stopped. They stopped too. That was the first time I became genuinely uncomfortable with the idea that they might be aware of us. We waited for a while, then started moving again. They followed for several minutes before gradually falling behind. I remember checking the rear camera repeatedly because I expected to see them return, but they remained near the crack. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the submarine began losing power. It was not a complete failure. The lights dimmed, the external cameras went off, and several instruments restarted. The main system stayed active, but everything became unstable for a few seconds. I checked the battery readings and could not find a reason for it. There was still plenty of power available. Then the lights came back. Something was attached to the outside of the submarine. I could see it through one of the forward cameras. It was one of the transparent creatures, but it looked different from the others. Its body was pressed flat against the hull, and several thin parts had spread across the metal. I initially thought it had simply landed there because of the current. Then I noticed that it was moving. The creature slowly pulled itself across the hull. I watched it reach one of the external cameras. The image disappeared. Another camera went out a few seconds later. We changed the view to the rear camera, and I could see the creature moving toward another part of the submarine. I checked the pressure readings again. They were still normal. That was when I started thinking about what had happened to the camera earlier. The creature had gone through the metal without damaging it. If it could do the same thing here, the thickness of the hull would not matter. We moved away from the crack as quickly as we safely could. The creature remained attached for a while, then disappeared from the camera. For several seconds, nobody knew where it had gone. I kept looking at the instruments because I did not want to look around the inside of the submarine. I knew that made no sense. If something had entered the pressure chamber, the sensors would have shown a change. There was no reason to believe it was inside. Then I noticed a small change in temperature. It was coming from behind me. I turned around slowly. There was nothing there. The temperature returned to normal a few seconds later. I remember feeling foolish for being so nervous about it. I checked the equipment again and found that one of the cooling lines had changed slightly. That gave me an ordinary explanation, and I held onto it because I needed one. We continued our ascent. The deeper part of the crack was disappearing below us, and the readings were returning to what we had seen earlier. For the first time since the creature appeared, I thought we might actually get out without anything else happening. Then the sonar picked up the large shape again. It was below us, but this time it was moving upward much faster. The pilot changed direction and started moving away from the crack. The sonar image followed us for several seconds before suddenly disappearing. I remember thinking we had finally lost it. Then, The depth reading changed. The submarine began sinking. We had not commanded a descent. The pilot was trying to bring us upward, but the submarine was still moving down. I checked the ballast system and found that it was functioning normally. The controls were responding, but the submarine was losing upward movement as if something was pulling against it. The pilot increased power. We moved upward a little. Then the submarine dropped again. That was when I looked through the lower observation window. The crack was directly beneath us. Something was coming through it. I could see several transparent bodies rising from the opening, and behind them was the larger creature we had seen earlier. It was difficult to make out because of its size, but I could see enough of it to know that it had moved much closer. The smaller creatures were spreading around it. They were not moving randomly anymore. They were moving upward together. We managed to get the submarine moving again, but it was taking much more power than it should have. I kept watching the depth reading while the others worked on the systems. We were only a few hundred feet above the crack, yet the submarine felt as though it was struggling against a strong current. Then the lower camera came back on. I looked at the screen and saw something I still have trouble explaining. The rock layer beneath us had opened. The crack was much wider than before. It looked as though a section of the seafloor had shifted sideways, revealing a large opening underneath it. The camera adjusted its focus, and I could see beyond the first layer. There was another body of water underneath the ocean floor. It was much larger than the space we had seen earlier. The camera could not show the far side. I watched the feed as the submarine slowly moved upward, and the opening remained beneath us. The strange part was that the water below did not look like a small underground pool or a flooded cave. There was movement everywhere. I saw several creatures pass through the camera's light, then several more. I adjusted the display because I thought I was seeing reflections. I was not. There were living things moving beneath the seafloor in every direction. The camera had only shown us a small section before, but now the opening was wider, and we could see much farther inside. There were shapes in the distance that were larger than the submarine. There were smaller ones moving between them. Some were almost completely clear. Others had faint bodies that reflected our light. I remember looking at the screen and trying to understand how something like that could have existed beneath the ocean without anyone knowing. We kept climbing. The opening slowly became smaller behind us, but just before it disappeared from view, the camera picked up something else. There was a second layer beneath the first, and below that, the sonar was showing another open space. We had spent the entire expedition believing that we were investigating cracks in the deepest part of the ocean. We had not yet reached the bottom. We had only reached the first layer covering whatever was underneath. We spent the next several minutes trying to get back to the route we had used during the descent, but the submarine was still behaving strangely. The controls worked, but our climb was much slower than it should have been. I kept checking the depth because I wanted to know how much distance we had put between ourselves and that opening. At that point, I was no longer interested in collecting more footage. I wanted to get back to the surface and let someone else decide what we had found. The problem was that the route we had come down through was no longer easy to follow. The crack had changed while we were down there, and several of our cameras were still not working. We were relying mostly on sonar and the instruments inside the submarine. The pilot was trying to keep us on the same path, but the readings kept changing. It felt like we were moving through a place that had shifted while we were inside it. We eventually found what looked like the original opening, but when we moved toward it, the sonar showed solid rock in front of us. We backed away and tried another direction. That was when the pilot noticed something unusual on the depth display. We were still descending, even though the controls were set for an ascent. I remember checking the reading myself because I thought I had misunderstood it. The number was increasing. We were going deeper. Nobody had touched the controls, and the ballast system was still responding normally. We increased power and managed to slow the descent, but we could not stop it completely. The submarine continued moving down at a steady rate, and the depth kept increasing. I spent the next few minutes checking every system I could think of. I was looking for something simple like a damaged ballast tank or a problem with the pressure controls. I wanted a mechanical explanation because mechanical problems could be fixed. The readings did not give me one. Then the sonar showed another opening below us. It was almost directly beneath the submarine. We were being pulled toward it. The pilot tried moving sideways, but the submarine responded slowly. We passed through a narrow section of rock and entered another open space. The transition was so smooth that I almost did not realize we had crossed into it until the sonar changed. The space below was much larger than the one we had seen earlier. I could see movement on several of the external cameras that were still working, There were transparent creatures everywhere. Some were close to the submarine, while others were far below us. The farther our lights reached, the more shapes appeared. I remember trying to count them at first. That lasted maybe 10 seconds. There were too many. They were moving in different directions, and some were so far away that I could only see a faint outline when they crossed the light. I started thinking about the first creature we had seen and how unusual it had seemed at the time. Looking at what was below us now, I realized that the first one had probably been no more important to this place than a fish swimming past a boat. The submarine continued descending. The depth reading had passed the level we had originally planned to reach, and we were now well beyond anything I had experienced before. I could feel the pressure in my ears even though I was inside the pressure chamber. I kept swallowing and trying to clear them. The others were doing the same thing. At one point, one of the crew members noticed something on the rear camera. I looked at the screen and saw that several of the creatures were following us again. There were more of them than before, and some were much larger. They stayed behind the submarine as we descended. I remember wondering if they were following because they were curious or because they had some other reason for staying near us. I still do not know. We reached a depth that was roughly 4,000 feet below the level of the deepest part we had originally been sent to investigate. I know that number because I wrote it down later from the recorded data. At the time, I was too busy watching the instruments to think much about it. Then the environment changed. The water temperature dropped suddenly, and the sonar stopped showing the rock walls around us. For several seconds, it looked as if we were in open water again. I checked the depth because I thought we might have somehow entered another section of the trench. We had not. The sonar was showing a large open space beneath us and around us. There was no clear bottom. The pilot slowed the submarine, and we stayed in place for a while. The external lights showed small particles moving through the water, but beyond them there was nothing I could use to judge distance. Then something appeared in the distance. At first I thought it was another rock formation. As it moved closer, I could see that it was alive. It was transparent, but unlike the smaller creatures, I could not see its entire body. Parts of it were almost invisible, while other parts reflected the lights. It was so large that our cameras could only capture sections of it at a time. I watched it move underneath us. The smaller creatures that had been following the submarine moved away from it. That was when I first noticed that the animals we had been seeing were not all the same. There were different sizes, different shapes, and what looked like different ways of moving. Some stayed close to the bottom. Some moved through the water like fish. Others simply drifted until they suddenly changed direction. And there were a lot of them. We had entered an environment that appeared to have been completely untouched by humans. The longer we stayed there, the more we saw. There were things that looked like long, transparent worms moving through the water. There were larger shapes with several thin limbs. There were creatures that seemed almost flat and moved slowly along the rock. Some were so clear that I only noticed them when they crossed in front of another object. At one point, the camera showed what looked like a group of them gathered around a large opening in the rock. The opening was different from the cracks above. It was wide enough that our submarine could have passed through it. We moved closer because we needed to understand what we were looking at. I remember thinking that this was probably the most important discovery anyone on the expedition would ever make. I was still thinking about the scientific side of it, even after everything that had happened. Then the camera moved past the opening. There was another space behind it, and then another. The rock beneath the ocean floor was not a single layer. There were several layers. We had assumed the deepest known part of the ocean was the bottom because we had never had a reason to believe there was anything below it. Now we were sitting thousands of feet beneath it, surrounded by water and living things. The crew began recording everything. I kept switching between cameras because I was afraid we would lose the footage. Some of the creatures came close enough that I could see them clearly on the screens. Their bodies were almost clear, but they had faint lines running through them. I could not tell what those lines were. Then one of the external cameras showed something that made me stop paying attention to everything else. There was a large group of the creatures moving upward. At first I thought they were simply changing direction. Then I realized they were all heading toward the layers above us. More appeared behind them. Then more. The camera could not show the entire area, but every time we moved the view, there were more. I started looking at the sonar. The readings were filling with movement. The deeper we scanned, the more living shapes appeared. It was impossible to estimate how many there were because the sonar was picking up things far beyond the range of our lights. I remember sitting there and thinking about the cracks we had been sent to investigate. Then I thought about the creature that had reached the surface. I had heard about it before the expedition, but nobody had known where it came from. At the time, I had assumed it was simply an animal that had somehow reached shallower water. Looking at all those creatures beneath us, I began wondering how many others had already found their way through the cracks. We started preparing to leave. The problem was that we no longer knew which direction led back to the upper layer. The pilot used the sonar to find the path we had come through, but several openings looked almost identical. We had also traveled far enough that our original route was difficult to identify. We chose one and began moving upward. After a few minutes, the creatures started following us again. There were hundreds of them around the submarine by then. I could see them through the lights, moving along with us as we climbed. Then the sonar showed movement above us. There were creatures coming down from the upper layer too. We stopped the submarine and waited. For several minutes, I watched the screens as the two groups moved around each other. Then I realized something that I still have not been able to explain. The creatures coming from above were much smaller than the ones below us. They were moving through the same opening we had used to enter. I remember watching them pass upward and wondering how long they had been doing that. We continued our climb after they moved away. The depth reading slowly decreased, but the number of creatures around us did not. At one point, I looked through the forward window and saw several hundred faint shapes moving through the water ahead of us. They were spread across the area as far as the lights could reach. We had only been down there for a few hours, but by then I had stopped thinking of the place as a cave. It was an ocean beneath our ocean, and we had no idea how far it extended. We kept climbing because there was nothing else we could do. The submarine was already using more power than it should have been, and we had no idea how long the systems would continue working. I remember watching the battery level more than anything else because it gave me something simple to focus on. Every few minutes I checked it, then checked the depth, then looked at the cameras. I had done the same thing on every previous dive, but this time I was doing it almost without thinking. The creatures continued following us. Some stayed close to the submarine while others moved farther away. There were so many that I could no longer tell where one group ended and another began. Every time one of the cameras turned, more appeared in the distance. I remember thinking that we had probably seen only a small part of the lower ocean when we were down there. We eventually found the opening we had entered through, but it had changed again. The gap between the layers was wider, and pieces of rock had shifted around it. We had to move slowly because there was very little room for error. The submarine passed through the opening and entered the upper layer, and almost immediately the sonar readings changed. The creatures followed us. I could see them moving through the opening behind the submarine, and some were already ahead of us. They seemed to have no trouble moving through the rock layers. They simply passed through the gaps and continued upward. That was when I started thinking about the first creature we had seen. It had not escaped from somewhere nearby. It had come through these layers. I remember asking myself how long it had taken for that creature to reach the upper ocean, and whether it had been the only one. At the time, I still hoped there were only a few of them. It was easier to think that way. We continued climbing. The deeper layers slowly disappeared below us, and the pressure readings began returning to levels the submarine was designed to handle. The instruments started behaving normally again, which was probably the first thing that made me believe we were actually going to survive. Then, one of the cameras picked up movement above us. There were more creatures coming down. At first, I thought they were the same ones that had been following us, but the shapes were different. Some were much smaller. Others were longer and thinner. They moved through the water toward the lower opening, and then they disappeared through it. More came after them. I watched for several minutes, trying to understand what I was seeing. There were hundreds. I am certain of that number, because we later went through the recorded camera footage and counted the ones visible in several different sections. We could not count every creature in the area, so the actual number was probably much higher. They were moving through the cracks in both directions. Some were going down. Some were coming up. We had spent the entire mission thinking the cracks were something that had recently opened. By then, I was starting to wonder whether the cracks had been there for much longer and had simply become larger recently. We finally reached the original section of the seafloor. The submarine stopped descending and began climbing normally. I remember feeling exhausted even though I had barely moved from my seat. My hands were sore from gripping the edge of the console, and I realized I had been doing it for a long time. We passed the area where we had first seen the creatures. The crack was still there. The camera showed the opening getting smaller as we moved upward, but I could see several of the transparent animals around it. Then the camera lost focus. I assumed it was another equipment problem. When the image returned, I saw something that I still think about more than anything else from that expedition. There was a creature on the seafloor above the crack. It was one of the transparent ones, but it was much smaller than the large creatures we had seen below. It moved across the bottom and then disappeared into another crack. I remember realizing that it had probably been one of the creatures that reached the upper ocean. The Marine Corps had found those cracks before us. They had found the first evidence of something living beneath the deepest known part of the ocean. We just had not understood what we were looking at. The rest of the ascent was almost normal. That is probably the strange part of the story that I have the hardest time explaining. After everything we had seen, the submarine simply continued upward. The systems stabilized. The cameras began working again. We checked each other for injuries and went through the emergency procedures we had practiced before the expedition. Nobody had been physically hurt. We were just tired and confused. When we eventually reached the surface, the recovery crew brought us aboard the main vessel. I remember stepping onto the deck and feeling the wind because I had forgotten what moving air felt like after spending so many hours inside the submarine. The official report was changed later. I was not involved in writing the final version, but I was told that several parts of our recorded footage would not be included. The expedition was described as an investigation into an unstable geological area, and the strange biological findings were treated as something that required further study. I was asked not to discuss what we had seen outside the team. I followed that instruction for a long time. I also stopped going on deep-sea expeditions. For months after we returned, I had trouble sleeping. I would wake up thinking about the submarine sinking and check the depth without realizing what I was doing. Sometimes I would turn on the light and sit there for a few minutes before remembering that I was in my own room. The thing that changed me most was not the large creature or the way they could move through metal. It was knowing how many of them were down there. Before that expedition, I had always thought of the ocean as a place where humans had explored only a small part. I knew that was true, but it had never really meant anything to me. Afterward, I understood how little that really meant. A few months later, another survey was carried out in the same general area using unmanned equipment. I never saw the full report, but I was able to see some of the data before access was removed. There were more cracks. Several of them had appeared farther away from the original site. The strange part was that some of the cracks were in areas that had never shown any signs of movement before. I remember looking at the map for a long time because the locations did not seem connected. They were spread across different parts of the ocean. I eventually stopped trying to understand it. I still think about the first creature we saw. I remember how small it looked on the camera, and how easy it was to assume that we had simply found an unusual animal. At the time, I thought the worst thing that could happen was that we had discovered something dangerous. I was wrong about that. The last piece of footage I personally watched before the expedition files were taken away showed the lower ocean from one of the cameras. The image was poor, but the lights reached far enough to show the water below us. There were transparent creatures moving through it in every direction. I could see large ones and small ones, shapes I recognized and others I could not make sense of. They were spread across the entire area that the camera could reach. And while we had been watching them from inside the submarine, more were moving upward through the cracks. I have never gone back into deep water since then. I still work around the ocean, but I stay near the surface now. I do not care about reaching places nobody has reached before, and I do not feel embarrassed about that anymore. The last thing I remember from that expedition happened after we were already back on the ship. I was standing near the equipment room when someone brought in a damaged sensor from the submarine. There was a small, clear mark on the metal housing. It looked like a scratch at first, but when I looked closer, I could see that the mark went through the metal and continued across the inside surface. I asked for the sensor to be put away because I did not want to look at it anymore. I never found out what happened to it. What I do know is that the creature we saw near the surface was not alone. There were hundreds beneath us, and by the time we left, more were already moving through the cracks toward the ocean above.